Hey guys, once again, we'd like to welcome you to one of our equity and energy podcasts. Today we're blessed and really excited, man, to have Dave Parker here, the author of Trajectory Startup. I think that I think when I was doing my post, I called him the startup guru, but I had the opportunity to meet the guy, inside the guru, and I kind of want to just kind of hang out with him today and just kind of talk about how things have been going and just a little bit about the startup world. So Dave, how are you doing?
I'm great, Leroy. It's good to see you again. It's been too long.
Good, man. I'm good. I have been really excited working with our first cohort. That's the one that you actually kind of brought us through the high growth part, and we've been getting those guys some opportunities. So they're kind of busy, but it's been fun though.
Great. That's awesome. Always good to see where the teams go from the early days. We're talking about like, hey, what's your go-to-market plan and what's your business and how do you explain the business? And then hopefully by the end of the program, they actually can explain the business in a reasonably articulate way, we hope. It always makes it easier for fundraising if you can explain the business, that's for sure.
Most definitely. So Dave, tell me, so you had a chance to come down and hang out with us a little bit. Mm-hmm. We was at Dillard. I think you came from one of our speakers. Just having an opportunity to hang out with OHub and what we're doing here in the New Orleans area. Can you kind of just talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah. So what's interesting for me contextually, Leroy, is I've got a chance to hang out in a ton of communities globally that are starting ecosystems for startups, right? They're early. So like Seattle, where I live, is a pretty mature ecosystem. I'd say since I started my first company in '98 till today, it's evolved a lot. And I think people who are new to the ecosystem in Seattle are always really critical, right? They're like, oh, Seattle doesn't have what San Francisco has, right? And every community compares itself to San Francisco. It never, like Seattle doesn't compare itself to Vancouver, Canada, right? We only compare ourselves to the next bigger city. And I think that, as you look at emerging markets for startups, I think NOLA's got it going on and resources are coming together, and it's never as mature as you want it to be when you're a startup founder and you're like, oh, there's not enough angel investors, or oh, there's not enough VCs. We've had that complaint in Seattle in the 20 years I've been doing this, maybe
Mm-hmm.
more, right? It's like it
Right.
never changes. And just recently I got back from a trip to Moldova, which some of the audience, hopefully some know where it is, but if you look at a map and see Ukraine, it's in the southwestern corner of the Ukraine, and it's kind of the breadbasket of Central Europe. And I was there 11 years ago, and they invited me back to do a keynote. And the big difference was, I'd say 11 years ago, we were talking about how difficult it was to incorporate and how hard it was to give feedback to the government. And by contrast, before my keynote, the president of the Republic of Moldova got up and spoke about how important this sector is to jobs in Moldova. And somebody was asking me like, hey, what's the big difference you noticed from 11 years ago when you're here to now? And I'm like, well, 11 years ago people were scared to talk about, even complain about how the government did something, and today the president of the country is here. So you have to think about community development as something that takes decades, right? So
Yeah.
startups take years, right? 7 to 12, but building a community is standing on the shoulders of giants. So the stuff that you guys are doing now will pay off in 10 and 20 years from now. And as much as some people today will be like, oh, no, is that great for startups? The answer is no, but you know what? It'll be better next year. And there's a flywheel effect involved. And as that happens, you just have to have a long-term view. What's the old proverb? The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago or today.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've been blessed here too, man. I can tell you that, like you said, we are standing on shoulders, man. There's a lot of people who have paved the way, took the bumps and bruises. Um, and when I came in a year ago, for the most part, I'm connecting the dots, based on all the work that they have done and then all the new resources that are coming down the pipeline. So we definitely understand that. And shout out to our ecosystem pioneers and path founders who have done an excellent job of just, setting us up for the success that we've had so far too.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think one of the things that we talked about when we were here, we talked about a couple of things, but I think I want to kind of give some homage to you, Washington Huskies. They did a great job this year.
We did. We finished second, right? But that's still, at least you make it to the big show. And then
Yeah,
we stole kind of a famous athletic director down from you guys and down there, and then he turned around and left us for USC. So I mean, I can't, other than they have the world's worst fight song at USC. So I just can't imagine why he would go. But with success comes change, right? I mean,
yes, yes,
the consistency. We've got some issues we've got to overcome around financing and all that stuff. And whoever the athletic director is coming in has some change involved. And I don't know. I think for startup founders, I think we're wacky. We self-inflict change. If anybody
yeah,
read the latest Elon Musk book, it's like it's kind of like watching a low-speed train crash, because there's times where you're like, he has to go inflict this thing on the organization because it's like things are going too well.
hmm,
Um, by the way, not my words, the author's words of hanging out with Elon. So I'm not an Elon critic. I think he's done amazing things, and I think the thing that people brought up, or the thing he brought up, was, do you expect somebody who's trying to change the world and cars to electric cars and take people to Mars is going to be like a normal person you'd hang out with? And the answer is, yeah, probably not.
yeah,
So
yeah.
hey, you got that going for you.
How about this, man? Hold on, let me turn this
That's
on.
okay.
Here we go. So Dave, we have, and I think that there's some organizations here that have kind of started using your book. And man, after having a chance to read it, I think the thing I came up with was that you're just brutally honest, right? Like,
Hopefully with a little bit of compassion thrown in there too, I hope.
yeah. Oh, it's
But
man,
honest.
it's humor, it's compassion, it's all of that. But I like the fact of you just really getting people to the point of understanding it's more important to shed a bad idea than it is to fail badly, right? To rush to a fail.
Yeah.
Now,
I think one of the things that we see, especially in coming out of Silicon Valley, is there's a privilege that goes with it that says, hey, I can fail fast because I have a rich uncle in commercial real estate. And, for me, I was very fortunate to get a scholarship to the University of Washington. If for those of you, for your listeners, you remember Caddyshack the movie, that's how I got to college. And people are
Okay.
like, "Oh, you grew up at a country club," and the answer is, "Yeah, cleaning urinals and picking up golf balls." Right? It wasn't it wasn't because my parents were members, but being raised on a single mom with food stamps, that was it's the only college I applied to. Right? So you take the privilege where you get it. In my case, it
Yeah.
was I got to use the opportunity to go to the University of Washington. And the funny thing is, dude, I thought a banker was a bank teller, right? So if you asked me back then, like, hey, could you? Because I spent most of my time over the last 5 years doing sell side merger and acquisition work and helping founders sell their companies, which is a broker or a banker. And if you said, hey, when you so at some point in your career you're going to be a banker, I'm like, I'm going to be a bank teller, because I didn't even know what a banker was.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the thing that I wanted to bring to the book was no theoreticals. Right? There's nothing there that I haven't done or experienced or tried, and there's stuff that we took out of the book with the publisher. Like, would I like you to know how to manage a board meeting? That would be awesome. But honestly, if you don't get a product market fit, you don't need to know that. Like, how do you build a great culture in a startup? Well, if you and I are startup founders, we have personalities. We don't have culture. And the investors are either going to like our personalities or they're not. But the idea of, culture eats strategy for breakfast is true, except when it's not. And in the case of startups, it's not true. Now, if you're doing a services business and that's what you're differentiating, if you and I were accountants and we're building the Brown Parker brand of accounting firms based on the
Mm-hmm.
quality of our services,
Mm-hmm.
sure, culture is super important for us to recruit people. But when you're building a product company, your first milestone is product market fit. Everything else is secondary. So, does my product get traction? Does the customer care? And when you look at the math, 90% of startups fail, which means we're asking the wrong questions when we decide to go do a startup. Otherwise, 90% of companies would succeed, right? Or at least it would be better than 90% failure rate, right? Some would say it's even higher than 90%, but those are difficult numbers.
But I like the way you kind of encourage folks to go, hey man, they take those, was it 2 hours a week, 20 hours, 2 hours a day, 20 hours a week, something like that, and do that within the first 6 months. Put the work in to really find out, is this a good idea or a viable decision? And by putting it in early, you figure out those product market fits, and you figure out what that first customer or what your customers are going to think about your product.
Yeah, I mean, the process is really it's customer development. Steve Blank and Eric Ries talked about it in the Lean Startup. Steve wrote about it first. Eric was Steve's best student, by the way, and he simplified it, right, for Lean Startup. So everybody looks at Lean Startup and says, "Oh, that was the first." It's actually the second. He just simplified it. But their whole concept was go get out of the building before you build product. And there's a parallel process to building product called customer development. There's product development, and the concept there is you get out and go ask the customers what questions you want to get answered. And one of them is, would you pay for this? And one of them is, what feature would you like? And what problem am I solving? So there's a very structured way to go about asking those questions. And it's funny because I always get these questions from very smart people who say, yeah, Dave, but Henry Ford, if he asked his customers what they wanted, he said it would have been a faster horse. And my grandfather had the first Ford garage in Camas, Washington in 1911.
Mm.
Now, he sold it too early because there's no libraries named after Mike Land, right? There's no people named after Parker Library. And but he started the first phone company in Southwestern Washington after that. And then he finished his career running a local grocery store.
Okay.
And in 1911, they didn't have the assembly line until 1913. So I always remind those founders that in 1911, there was no internet. Like, you couldn't ask the question. I couldn't do a remote survey, right? Where,
Right.
But anytime you're building a product nobody else has built before, that's always the question, right? Because
Right.
they don't have something to compare it to, right? So before Airbnb, it was go find a hotel room. And you're like, hey, we're going to do something new. And people are like, I don't know, do I want a stranger hanging out in my house? And the answer to that one was really a timing question. which is post-Great Recession, the answer was, I don't really want that, but I need to make my mortgage. So, okay, right? And the same thing was true with Uber. But all of the disruptive technologies, and I would call those new and nascent markets. So when I was at Fearless Fund, we definitely had a thesis that was, hey, we want to have roughly 25% of our investments in categories that are new and nascent markets. Nobody's ever disrupted this market before. And by definition, you can't be like, oh yeah, I saw somebody do that. You could be like, oh yeah, I saw somebody do that in a different market, but I have never seen anybody do it in this market. And then the question becomes a market question. Is this market big enough that if we win, it can have a disproportionate return? So that's a little bit of the way you have to think about it now from the investor side is, you know, every founder is totally passionate about their idea, and every founder wants to succeed, and every founder wants to get funding, but not every investor maps to your desire for what it is they're after. So, and I think that's a force of will question that founders get a lot, which is like, oh, I went and talked to this investor and they told me it was awesome, but they didn't write me a check. And I'm like, that's kind of their way to pat you on the head and move you along. Right. To be honest, because they either didn't understand it, right? Were you able to explain the idea in the first place? Or in your lack of understanding of it, were you able to articulate how big the market was? So for Fearless Fund, I was at Fearless for 2 years until the lawsuit recently, and we can get into that too if you want to. But we basically put a process together that allowed us to say to the 130 companies we saw a month. So again, this is just the other side of how the sausage is made, right, on the investor pool. We get 130 deals coming in a month, and part of what we were looking for was how do you do a screen on those in a way that's quick and consistent, that says, oh, we want more information about that company. And for founders, they always look at it and like, well, why wouldn't you want information about my company anyway? And the answer is, well, if you're not in our thesis, right? So we invested in women of color founded startups, in consumer packaged goods, and technology. So if you had a pharma idea or a local business idea, the answer is we're out. It's because it's not in our thesis. And what we've committed to the thesis for our limited partners, our investors, is we stay on thesis because that's why they gave us money to invest. So we're investing on their money on behalf of them as long as we stay consistent with the thesis. And so one of the funny things is, like, my wife's in pharma, and if you brought me a pharma deal, I may like it, but since it's not in thesis, we're not going to invest in it. So we had basically 4 criteria we used that were kind of our fast 4. And in the book, you'll see the 10 criteria that you typically are scoring on. And we go through that in the course work as well. So when we do the next NOLA Energy program, we'll talk about these 10 things. But the 4 you need to worry about from the fast, what we would call a fast 4, was 1A and 1B were really tied together. You couldn't talk about the team without talking about the market, and you couldn't talk about the market without talking about the team. So we always looked at 1A was the market. Do we think this is a big and growing market or not? And do we have a thesis on that market and a belief in that market? 1B then became the team, because even a great team in a crappy market is going to get a bad result. Yeah. But an okay team in a blockbuster market can get a killer result. So some people are like, it's all about the people. I'm like, kind of. It's actually all about the market first and the people second, but they're tightly tied together, right? I don't think you can do one without the other. So there's a concept of founder market fit. Are you the right founder to do this thing as well? Not just, is this the right product to do it? And then the third piece is really the product. Like, do the customers love it? Is it super sticky, right? And the fourth thing is traction, which is tightly tied to product, which it doesn't have to be revenue necessarily. It could be user growth. It could be customer development interviews, and it could be revenue. But what you're after with that one is, I'm looking for a proof point, especially if I'm in the seed stage, that the customer actually wants this product and is willing to pay for it. So there's in investing in venture, there's pre-seed, seed, and Series A. In the pre-seed, we tend to think about that as, friends, family. Sometimes it's called friends, family, and fools, because it's super risky, right? The answer is, I have no data. I have an idea, and I have no product, and I have no what's called unit economics. When you move to the institutional investor stage, that's called seed stage, which is typically what we did. We were 20% pre-seed, 60% seed, 20% post seed, which is usually Series A and above. But we're trying to show conviction in areas where we can make a significant investment and have an impact, right? So that was kind of the way we looked at it. And I say that so that your audience, if they're founders and they're thinking about, I'm going to go pitch an investor, you really need to understand the investor side of the table, right? Which is they actually need a return. And as founders, we're in the weeds thinking about, what's the feature set I need to ship next, and I got to get the right developer to do it. And we're down in the weeds of the product. And the investors are the side of the return and thinking backward to the product. It's what sits in the middle is I've got return on one end, right? I've got product on the other end. And what sits in the middle is this concept of unit economics, which is how do you make money, right? And if you don't know the answer to that question, the answer is investors are pretty shy, right? And the more you know about how you make money, the more investors will lean in and go like, oh, maybe now's a good time to invest.
Yeah.
But you have to get to that unit economic numbers as fast as you can to survive in a startup.
And I think one of the things you said about your book is it's not just for a founder. It's for the person that supports the founder. It's for the VCs who's analyzing or who's looking at a founder. It's for the friend who's trying to find the best way to tell his friend that you might want to do something, right? So the book is for everyone. I think the way that it helps me is that it puts so much emphasis on securing that customer that it allows me that when I'm developing my side of the ecosystem, I'm looking for resources. I'm looking for customers. I'm looking for folks that we can find very early. Like if we plug into this, you're going to be able to have a really solid conversation around, is this something that this client or other clients that look like this can use it? Or is this something that, may not necessarily have the traction here, it may not have a traction in the state that you think it should be. But I think that, like you said, that book is for everybody. And it put me in the space of, if I can create as many resources, if I can create as many opportunities for these guys to get customers, or at least to get quality information from the customers, I keep them within that 6-month mark of really figuring out if it's a great idea, if it's something I need to move away from.
Yeah. We've done the same thing here in Seattle. We created a program from the Washington Tech Industry Association a few years ago, now 5 years ago. And we call it the Founder Cohort Program. It's kind of a post-accelerator program. So it's really designed for that group that's coming out of your guys' program. And then says, hey, how do we help you navigate the Seattle ecosystem in 6 months instead of 18 months?
Okay.
Because for a startup, that's the difference between success and failure, right?
Yeah.
And failures, you and I've talked about it, failure is expensive and it's painful. And, founders believe to a fault, like we're delusional in what we believe. We're like second mortgage on our house and it'll be awesome. And so what we've been able to work with now, we just started cohort 11. It's actually our biggest cohort. Yeah, we typically have done 20-ish companies twice a year. So we've worked with about 230 companies, and they've raised in aggregate over $320 million.
Wow.
And so all credit to them, right? We don't take any fees or take any equity, or we had two objectives in mind when we kicked off this program. One was we wanted to help you navigate at 6 versus 18, because we recognize that getting you in front of the right people at the right time with stage appropriate resources was everything, right? It's back to your resource question. Like if I can get you the right resources at the right time, that's huge. The second thing we wanted to kick off was this concept of the PayPal mafia. And the concept there was, okay, back when Elon and Reid Hoffman and that whole crew were doing X.com and PayPal, they all knew each other. And then as they all went off to go start their own startups, they all co-invested in each other. So there's a concept of recycled capital that's unique to Silicon Valley that doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. And so when we started this 5 years ago, I told the WTIA CEO at the time, it's a big nonprofit that supports technology companies in the Seattle, Washington state area. And I'm like, you need to judge this in 10 years, right? Not before. Like there's just no way you can judge it before. And I think we've got some momentum, and I'll pull off the trajectory name for that. I think we've got the right trajectory with the companies we work with so far, but until they start reinvesting in each other, and we saw that recently. We were running the trajectory series program that I run for ideation founders at the local level. It's open, it's a meetup. You can come, you can not come, but you don't get a pitch if you didn't do the work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we have mentors who show up every month because you get a month between the sessions, so you got to go do the customer interviews.
Mm-hmm.
And so I reached out to the mentors in prep for last month to come, because I need like 8 or 10 mentors every month for the first hour to review your customer research. You went out and did the interviews. Tell us what you learned. And we had 40 founders reply. I kind of, it's kind of like the bat signal went up, and we're like, hey, we need some mentors to help, blah, blah, blah. And 40 people responded. And I'm like, that as a community makes me super happy. And again, all the credit goes to the founders, right? I'm in a fortunate spot where I've done 5 startups and exited 3 of them, where I get to help build community because there's no money in it, right? There's like, as you all are working on your startups, right, you need to get a return. And I'll talk with founders a lot, and they'll be like, oh, we're a for-purpose entity, or we're going to give back. Well, I'm like, my preference, right? And I'm not criticizing for-purpose entities, but my preference is go make a ton of dough and then give it away. Because if you're trying to give it away while you're trying to make a ton of dough, you are so at cross purposes with your objective. And again, I not being critical for the folks who've chosen to do that, but when you come to me for an investment, and you're like, hey, Dave, and we're going to give away X percentage of our profit, I'm like, as an investor, I don't know what to do with it, right? And it doesn't mean I don't think you have a good heart or a good mission. It just means I have to know I can get a return. And, with 90% of startups failing, especially the early stage startups, like the concept there is the venture power law, right? I mean, it's a long tail, right? So the top decile of my investments give me return the fund. My top quartile, or 25% return capital, could be 1.2, could be 0.8, could be 2.1 times revenues or investment. And then the 75% fail. And the bottom decile, or bottom 25%, fail super fast, usually within 6 to 9 months. And that's just the math of venture. So it makes it super painful. So anything you can do to mitigate that risk in advance, and for you, because you're the first investor, and you really need to just mitigate the risk and make sure that you have the best use of your time.
Now you talk a lot about, that clear go-to-market strategy when you get your project to that point. When you're talking about the go-to-market, what are some of the key elements of a successful go-to-market strategy, you think?
Well, so I think it depends on whether it's B2B or B2C, but the concept I would put forward for everybody is this concept of a product market pull test. So the idea there is, I have a thesis that this ideal customer profile wants to buy this product. And the concept there is, okay, so the product market pull test forces you to get out of abstraction and into super tactical solutions, right? Which is, okay, are you B2B or are you B2C? Okay, if you're B2B, and by the way, I lean totally B2B, right? So most of my examples will be B2B.
Mm-hmm.
But, as we're going out and testing it, so giving an example from one of the cohorts I worked with at an international company. They were based in Saudi. They're doing a gifting app. So where your family can put in what they want, and when it gets to birthday time or holiday times, whatever, you can decide what to get them. And they went in with a thesis that said, we have 3 distinct demographics. We have the younger, the middle, and the older. And the younger want the gifts, and the older have the money for the gifts, and the middle we think are kind of ambivalent. And I said, great. So that's your thesis. Let's go test it. So they went out and they spent, I think, about $330 total. IG ads, TikTok ads, they did video, and they did still images, which obviously still images still work on IG, but they don't really work on TikTok. And they came out and said, so in order to put an ad together, Leroy, right, you have to do the headline, you have to do the video and the offer, and then you're going to do an A/B test of the headline and the offer. And then you're going to run the ad. And they came back and said, You know what? That middle
Yeah.
group we thought was going to be ambivalent, they actually outperformed the other two groups like 3.3 to 1. So now we have a customer acquisition thesis based on data, not based
Mm-hmm.
on opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to get to the headline of the offer and the value proposition, right? So my observation as a marketer, not the world's greatest marketer, by the way, but my observation as a marketer, because I'm overly simple. If you spend money with the wrong value proposition focused at the wrong market, guess what?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to waste all of that money. So I'd rather you go spend $300 now and say, okay, you have a thesis. What is it? Who's the ideal customer profile? What's the value proposition? What's the offer? If you just do those three things, ICP, headline, offer, and then you go test it, you're going to come out with real data. And I will tell you, I'm consistently surprised by the outcomes, right? There's always something where you're like, I wouldn't have guessed that. And what's important about it from a founder perspective is it takes away the abstraction of like, well, anybody could use our product. And the answer is, that's not really true. And what you have to get to is, how do we make it simple for the customer to buy my product, especially if you're doing something new,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you're shipping a product no one's ever seen before, guess what? You can't buy traffic for it because
Mm-hmm.
no one's searching for it. So instead of doing inbound marketing, you're forced to do outbound marketing, which pushes you to, okay, what's the list of the ideal customer profile? So if you hired me to be your salesperson, you said, hey, Dave, here's our product, go sell it. My first response would be like, hey, Leroy, make the most of the time. I just want to pick up and randomly dial numbers. Like,
Mm-hmm.
who wants the product? And most of the time at the early founder stage, we haven't asked the hard questions about that. And that's one of the things we need to ask is, how do we ask these hard questions? And I've heard one other author call it the rat test, right? Which is, what's my riskiest assumption test?
I
And
like
for
that.
most of us as founders, right,
Mm-hmm.
the answer is, I don't know that I really want to know the answer to that question.
Mm-hmm.
Don't ask me that question,
Yeah.
right?
Let me stay excited about it.
Yeah, because it's the only idea I have. And if you take the
Yeah.
idea away from me, I'm no longer a founder. And my answer is, as a founder, I'm more risk averse now if I was to do a sixth startup than I was earlier,
Mm-hmm.
because my real question is like, is this really a big idea or not? Because a tip for the audience, right? It takes as much time to build a $4 million company as it does to build a $40 million company.
Mm-hmm.
It's a question of, is it a bigger market or not? And how hard is it to build the product? So if somebody came to me and said, hey, would you be my co-founder? I would be like, is it a big idea? Because if it's not a big idea, the answer is, I'm out.
And something you talked about too is like, don't be afraid to talk about your project. Don't be afraid to do the marketing. Don't be afraid to kind of put it out there. I know people think that they're going to, that somebody's going to swipe it, or, we always hear about, and this is old school spiritual stuff. It's real, man. Like, don't talk about your dreams because somebody might try to get
Steal your
trapped
dream.
on, right? But I think in the book it kind of talks about, you gotta put yourself out there.
Yeah, I think the faster you do it, the better.
Yeah.
And to your point is, I think you're right. I do think we have trauma in our history about how we think about those things. But
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, you have to find a customer, right? And the customer has to be willing to pay for your product. And the idea there is, if you go out and talk to the customer and they're not willing to pay for the product, then you want to know that sooner rather than later, and then pivot your time to go work on the next idea where the person actually wants to buy the product. They want to use it. So my observation is, it's a bit of an urban legend, right? Somebody's going to steal my idea. But if you and I started today with the same idea, we would end up in 6 months in completely different places, because you and I
Mm-hmm.
have different life experience. You're better at some things and I'm better at other things, right?
Mm-hmm.
The product and service would look completely different. And you just have to be aware of that going into it. Is, I don't think, a friend of mine said one time, ideas die from lack of exposure, not from overexposure. And I think that's incredibly true. So, but it
So,
is a reframe.
say it again.
I said that is a reframe to your point about dream stealers.
Oh yeah, man. Yeah. So,
I
so
never
you
thought about
got
it that way before.
it. Well, when I was thinking about this, you have to think about all our old school learnings, everything we learned about life and business and kind of how we protect our own personal information. And then all of a sudden we're in this new space and we have to move forward with the thinking of that space. But sometimes there's some things that Mama said, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. There's some, really,
Some
there's some
things we have to
very,
unlearn. Yeah. Oh,
yeah,
it's a great point, dude. I have not thought about it that way, but I see it in retrospect. I see it all the time,
yeah,
right? And it's like, and they're frames that are hard to unlearn
yeah,
because you're like you've held it to be true as the gospel, and when you see a conflict with whatever the gospel is you learned as a child, with the business or spiritual, right? It's always a little bit of a head jar.
right. That sometimes that fear and putting yourself out there has more to do with, you know, if somebody, what the opposition is going to do more so than I'm gathering information, like changing
Right.
our mindset around when we're putting ourselves out there, not so much to be judged, but to get as much information as we possibly can so we can make that decision within 6 months versus, having to go down with the ship.
Yeah. Well, and originally, when I originally named a program in the book, we called it 6 Month Startup. Part of it was I was coming out of Startup Weekend, obviously a brand. We had Startup Weekend, Startup Week, Startup Next, Startup Digest. But the idea of 6 Month Startup was, could you prove or disprove the idea in 6 months,
Okay.
right, as a place to start? And then I realized I had a brand problem because we were doing a 3-day version in boot camps in the Middle East, and we were doing a 5 Saturday version, like with you guys. And the brand didn't hold up to 6 Month Startup. But the theme in the 6 months in the book still holds up, which is if you can't get a customer to say yes in a 6 month window, and typically it happens faster, by the way, like usually as we go through this process now, we're doing it in 5 months and they get a pitch at the end. But like tomorrow night, we'll come back from this is the third session. So they learned customer development last month. So they can come back and talk about, we did 5 customer development interviews. What did you learn? Right. And they're going to talk with the mentors, but they had to do the work before they talk to the mentors. Right. And that's part of the requirement. If you've ever heard Jason Calacanis in Silicon Valley, he's got a megaphone. He's like, do the work, right? Versus
Yeah.
be stuck in your head, convinced that this is a brilliant idea that you're not going to talk to anybody else about. And the answer is, what was Mike Tyson's quote? Everybody has a plan until I smack him in the face or punch him in the face.
Right.
Getting out to talk to customers about your idea is, and it's scary, right? Because you're
Yeah.
like, because some of y'all have become an influencer on social and you're like, I'm an entrepreneur, right? And the answer is you haven't earned your first dollar yet, and you have to earn $1 to spend the next dollar.
Mm-hmm.
If you have that as the mindset that says, versus some of you are like, I'm going big, Dave, we have to go raise capital. Not in this market. Like when I did my first one in '98, sure, it was the back of a napkin and it was an idea. Could I raise money with an idea today? So you have different types of entrepreneurs. You have first-time founders, and the answer is you can't. You have serial entrepreneurs, right? I can probably do it. You have franchise entrepreneurs. Mark Cuban decides to go out and raise, not that he needs to. Mark Cuban decides to go out and raise. The answer is somebody will write Mark a check just because it's Mark, right? So, and there's not a lot of franchise players out there, right? There's a lot of serial players, but first-time founders, as much as you're impressive and I love you all, and you're all slightly delusional, and I love that about you because it's coming from a place of the heart, right? You also have to recognize you got to get data. So I'm glad you have an opinion. If you have an opinion and have data, you'll get a check. If you just have an opinion and they have an opinion, they have the checkbook, not going to get a check.
So we're saying take our time, really evaluate the idea being well, I say fast fail, but being able to exhaust the idea first in that 6 month period. I think it's great.
And pivoting. James's comment here is spot on. It's like I found his note: when you surround yourself with people who are chasing their own dreams, they're not interested in stealing yours, but want to help you succeed. I think that's one of the things we found with the cohort program. And I think if you're considering joining the NOLA cohort, it's very much the same, right? Being around like-minded people. It's not about having a coach necessarily. It's about having a cohort, right? And the cohort gives you a forum of people who are they're moving down the same path. They're not trying to get to the same product goal. They're trying to get the same life goal. And that's super valuable, right? Because we are a little weird, us entrepreneur types, right? We're not. I remember having a pastor friend at one point. He's like, "Why don't you just go get a job?" And like, "Why don't you not be a pastor?" Right? Because
Yeah,
the question is the same, right? And he was like, "Well, I couldn't not do that." And I'm like, "I'm wired to be a founder.
right.
I don't know what else. I've been kind of unemployable, right? Some of you want to be unemployable before you're ready, and the answer is keep your day job, go get the data, right? Validate, and
Hmm.
then it'll be less stressful on your relationships for sure.
And I like the concept of, and I'll be honest, that I'm in this space now for a year, but the energy of the founder, now I can, the tenacity and bravery that they bring into that space, man, is crazy. I mean, it's palpable. You literally you can feel it. So I
And
get
sometimes it's
that.
delusional. Sometimes
Huh?
it's without,
Oh
sometimes it's
yeah,
delusional. Sometimes it's without cause.
yeah,
I would like it to be more often with cause, but
yeah.
sometimes it's without cause.
But I mean, I think that, and that one of the ways that I think that what I like to do with the incubator with Nettie, I mean, we have great instructors. You guys are doing a great job, but being able to share that space and stay in contact with each other and having those moments when they can share and interact and support each other. You know, I think that some of our coolest meetups was when a lot of our founders came, and came and hung out. And then during lunchtime,
For
we
sure.
eating, yeah, man, we eating po' boys. Everybody get a chance to get a extra question in with you. I mean, so I think that being able to share that space is a great way to encourage each other too.
Density is one of the factors of startup communities. You have to have a certain amount of density to bring people together because
Hmm.
none of us are out operating on our own, right? So you're going to learn as much from the other founders in the cohort as you're going to learn from the instructors. But the thing I like about what you guys have put together for the instructors is there's no people doing theory there. There's no
Hmm.
professors there who, and I don't mean take anything away from professors,
Yeah.
but if you're going to learn how to do a startup, you should learn how to do a startup from somebody who's actually done a startup,
Hmm.
not from a service provider who's there trying to sell you something. Right. And it's like, because there's something about being around people who are like minded. You're like, they got a little smell of the battle on them. Right.
Yeah, and it's funny. I think I read where you researched probably over 2,600 businesses and maybe more by now, obviously,
Mhm.
before kind of sitting down and kind of think through this process as you're writing it. But there was
Mhm.
something that triggered that. There was somebody who asked you a question at one point in time.
Yeah. It's kind of a funny community thing. Somebody came to me. I was with Startup Weekend at the time, which is the nonprofit. I'd done 5 of my own startups, and somebody came to me and said, "Hey, can I have a copy of your financial template, your financial model?"
Hmm.
And I was like, "Sure, I'm a community guy, but mine is a B2B SaaS business, and
Hmm.
yours is a B2B to C, which by definition is a marketplace. Yours is B2B for inventory and customers over here for consumers, and that's by definition a marketplace." And I said, I'm happy to give it to you, but yours is a marketplace, mine's a SaaS company. And it got me asking the question, how many of these revenue models are there? And
Hmm.
come to find out, after tracking 2,600 companies for a 5-year longitudinal study, there's 14. That's it.
Yeah.
So my encouragement to folks listening is that I hope your product idea is unique. Great. How you're going to make money, almost guaranteed not to be unique. Now, if you come up with a 15th business model, revenue model, I'm happy to write about it. And a business model, by the way, has 3 parts, right? It's it's the cost to build the product. So it's
Hmm.
the product or service you're delivering, right? So those are all focused on the cost of the engineers and the people and the designers and et cetera, whether it's a service or product. So the cost to build, then you have the cost to sell the product, which is revenue model, pricing, marketing, and sales. So, because if I need 10 engineers to build it, how many people do I need to sell it? And then the last piece is what are the outcomes, right? And those outcomes are top line revenue growth, gross margin percentage, net profit. Those are outcomes. You don't have any control over them. I can control my cost to build it. I can control my cost to sell it, but I can't control the outcomes. Those are my inputs. right? So when you break it down and say, oh, that makes sense, that's the business model has those three big parts. The revenue model then are things like, is it a commerce model like Amazon? Or like, so Amazon is a great example because they use a bunch of different revenue models, but they are already at scale.
Mm-hmm.
So for you as a founder doing this early, the question is, are you going to be a subscription? Are you going to be a marketplace? Are you going to be commerce? And by the way, each of those revenue models have different market valuations from an investor perspective. So if you and I do $1 million consulting company and we go to sell it, we're going to sell it for roughly $1 million.
Mm-hmm.
But if we do $1 million subscription business and we go to sell it, we're going to sell it between $8 and $12 million.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a founder and you can choose how to market and do a revenue model, you'd want to choose a good revenue model, not a bad one. And it doesn't take any, again, it doesn't mean services businesses are bad businesses. No, that's not the point. Services businesses are just have different valuations than product companies. Because in order to scale the business, you have to scale people. So that's always part of the challenge.
So, because I don't want to get out of let my time slip away from it. I do have a couple of questions. They just kind of
shoot.
Good for me. Can you share a memorable experience from your own entrepreneurial journey that has shaped your approach to the startups? And I know we talked about how your ups and downs force you to research more, and I think you read over 100 books to this point, even more. So, can you kind of give me how your journey has shaped your approach to your startups and investing?
Sure. Yeah, so I would tell you the big one, and I actually wrote about in the book. And then after I wrote about it and the book was published, I reached out to Samantha Chan is her name. She was the managing director at a group called Warburg Pincus. So those of you who don't know Warburg Pincus by name, it's one of the largest private equity companies in the world. They were based in New York. I was out raising money for my first startup. We had an hour meeting back before COVID times, and where every meeting is 30 minutes. And the meeting went well. She's walking me to the elevator and she said, Dave, love your passion for this market. We generally like this market, but I can't repeat your message to my partners, so I won't.
Yeah.
And it was the most direct feedback, Leroy, I'd ever had, right? Because everybody else was like, because sometimes you as a founder, you're going to walk away and go like, oh, that meeting went great. And really, there's, wow, that person was really smart and I can't repeat your message. So, and the industry is based on, if you're an associate at a fund, my career at the fund is based on my ability to be articulate about what you told me about your idea. And if I can't repeat it and it helps my career, then I'm not going to repeat it. So you just have to simplify, right? You can be the smartest person in the room, but you may not get funded.
Tell me about that message. In that particular message, do you think it was not simple, or do you think it was just you being really excited about what you're doing and you wanted to talk about everything you knew in that meeting? Or like, what do you think you could have did looking back? What could you have done to giving her a message that she could have taken away?
I think the thing you need to do as a founder, for both me and for other founders that I see, is we have this recency bias. Mm-hmm. Like my CTO just quit, or our product didn't launch well, or we had a bad customer. Like, I'm so in the moment of what's going on right now. I tend to not abstract that from the simple message around, we do this for this customer with this value, and we make money this way. And then let the investor ask you questions. Oh, so you do this? Yep, that we do. And you make money that way. Yep, tell us more about that. Versus go dump the bucket, right? In the insecurity, right? We were talking earlier about like, hey, I got to school this way. I didn't really know business. So you're kind of dumping the bucket, hoping to impress the person.
Yeah.
And it doesn't help you. Right. And that's a bit of a personal challenge you need to work your way through. Is one of my mentors told me once, Leroy, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? And I'm like, I want to be both. He's like, you got to choose one, dude.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, I guess I want to be effective.
Yeah.
Right. And at the same time, you're like, I still want to do both because ego's involved. But you have to look at it and say, like, is that really what's more important? Is it more important to be right or more important to be effective? Yeah, having a chip on your shoulder is a good thing until it's not.
Yeah. But do you have proof that it's not working? I've seen that Sometimes
Yeah.
the chip version, that's not
Sometimes
going to
that's
be
years of therapy, by the way, and there's cheaper ways to get about it. It's just to go attack the change yourself.
So tell me, what emerging trends and technologies do you believe are having the biggest impact on startups right now?
Oh, it's without a doubt, it's AI, right? I mean,
Yeah.
AI is going to be like electricity at some point. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like yet, but when I think back to, I've got some vintage on me. So when I think back to looking at a 1995 Netscape browser for the first time and going, wow, AI is
Wow.
there for me right now. Like it's going to change everything.
Hmm.
We don't quite know how it's going to change everything yet, but in a few years, will you go to a Google browser to search for something when you can ask AI to do it for you? And in fact, for that matter, I can ask a bot to continue to do it for me. So I had a 1965 Ford Thunderbird at some point. I would love to just set a bot and say, hey, when you find a 1965 Thunderbird with under this many miles and this color convertible top and this color, seats, just tell me about it.
Hmm.
Right. So then
Yeah.
I can use my mental capacity to go work on something more interesting. I think there's that sort of change is so interesting. Right now, when you see it on a founder pitch deck and AI is on the first title slide, and you're like, I don't know where AI is on this, like, be cautious about that as a founder,
Hmm.
because the answer is you're talking to somebody who knows more about AI than you do. I also think it's a little bit funny that, our Web3 people who were experts on Web3, a year ago are now experts on AI.
Hmm.
There's always a trend in that, right? Because if there's something new, and you can use this to your advantage, just be careful about overplaying your hand, right? Which is when there's no experts, right? What's the other proverb? I guess we got two proverbs in one call. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed
So
man is king,
the one-eyed man's king. Yeah.
right? And in
Yeah.
AI right now, there's a lot of blind folks being led around by somebody who's also blind, right?
Yeah.
But saying that, but I don't know that you don't have an eye. So you're like, I got one eye. And I'm like, that's awesome. I'll follow you.
Yeah.
Just don't overplay your hand there, because you'll find people who want to invest, but then go, I don't know. I think that might really hurt your credibility. So be very tangible and very concrete, but I think it's
Mhm.
super exciting. Like if you'd asked me a year ago before ChatGPT, hey, would you ever do a sick startup? I'd have been like, dude, no. Like it's so much work, right?
Mhm.
And it's so hard to be successful. And now I would go, maybe I'd do it, right? It had to be a big enough idea, but it's changed everything, which to me is super
Yeah.
exciting. It's a great time to be a founder. There's a wave coming. We've seen a little bit of ripples on the front of the wave. We haven't seen the whole wave yet. And
Mhm.
when it comes in, it'll be really interesting and really big.
I think we're seeing people use AI to handle big data, crunching data, um, being able to um, kind of simulate what a plan for a city like New Orleans, after you look at 5 cities and kind of crunch that data, what that plan would look like for New Orleans. All those type of projects are pretty interesting right now.
Totally.
Having a chance to see them. Now, as a mentor and advisor, are there any mistakes that you see that are common? We kind of talked about a lot of it right now. Trying to make sure that we suss out our ideas as much as we can. But are you seeing any mistakes that founders are making, and how they can avoid them?
Well, I think the big one is just overcommitting on your personal finance before you have a planned revenue,
Okay.
right? And I don't mean to trivialize it, but I see founders, because we believe, right? People with cause to me, and people on a mission to me, are I want the worst implies a judgment level. They're my least likely to invest in, because people on a mission are like, we're going to go through this wall, whether there's a door there or not. And to me, that's a risky proposition where, as an investor, I'm like, we're going to go test these hypotheses. We think this is a great market. Here's why, but be scientific about it. And I don't mean to be scientific versus faith-based. That's not my point. But my point is you can use scientific method to go test your hypothesis, and you should, as
Yeah.
fast as you can, right? Believing without cause isn't believing. That's just illusion. And the customer ultimately is going to decide. You don't get to tell the customer how to buy stuff. So you have to go talk to the customer. You have to do it fast. And the faster you do it, the faster you'll either be like, yes, I'm onto something, or no, maybe I'm not onto something, or maybe the answer is the classic one is a friend of mine was a VC here in Seattle, and he invested in a company that was Uber before Uber, which
Mhm.
really meant it was Uber before the iPhone, and they were using text message. But before the iPhone, it didn't work. But
Mhm.
the idea was the same idea. It was just too early. And the hard part for us as founders when we're too early is we still believe, but we don't have enough money to train the market on why they should believe. Right. And those ones are the toughest ones for me. Being too late, you can either figure out how you be a fast follower or whatever. Being too early is the most painful one because you believe and the customer doesn't believe yet.
I guess, and we're getting ready to close out, but there's one that's really interesting to me. Am I standing in a, what is it? Am I standing in a graveyard?
Am I whistling past a graveyard?
Am I whistling
Yeah.
past the graveyard?
Yeah.
I think that'd be really
Totally the
neat for
case.
some like the new folks to hear a little bit about that.
Well, so the whistling past the graveyard is just like and you guys know in New Orleans because everything's above ground, right?
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
you're working on an idea that every idea in that category has died, and yet you're whistling past the graveyard, happy-go-lucky, and you're
Mhm.
ignoring all of the, and you guys it's like they're big tombs, right?
Yeah.
In our case, they're all underground in Seattle, but in they're just markers. But if you're whistling past a graveyard, when do you want to know? Do you want to know in 6 weeks? Do you want to know in 6 months? Do you want to know in 6 years? So I'll give you a funny example. We were doing the first startup weekend I ever took my son to. So startup weekend, I used to be the COO and senior VP of programs at before we sold it to Techstars. And you'd show up on Friday night, and by Sunday night you'd have a demo. And I ran into a guy there that was working on housing using containers.
Mhm.
And the rule at startup weekend is if nobody joined your team, you had to join somebody else's team because you couldn't do it by yourself. It was a team sport. It was like a pickup basketball game for startups. I hope they bring them back. And so one person had joined this guy's team, and Carson, I think then was like 15, 16 years old. And we walked out and he's like, Dad, there's some really stupid ideas there. I'm like, tell me more. Right. So I then ran into that same founder about 6 or 8 months later and at a different event. And I said, how long have you been working on this idea? He's like, I've been working on it for 7 years. And I'm like, oh my God, dude, don't go 8. Right. And because I
Yeah.
feel like somebody should have told him before 7 years have gone by, like,
Hmm.
oh, that's kind of cute. Right. And the answer is, will it ever make money? So there's this concept, of like, what's our true north or what's a first principle? The first principle of a business is it has to make money. You need that as the place to start. So Daisy says hi. And
What's
that's
up,
first
Daisy?
principle, right? If you can't make money, it ain't a business.
Right.
And if it's a nonprofit, go into it intentionally with a nonprofit with donors who can give you money. Because an unintentional nonprofit is a painful way to do a startup. It's just the worst.
So, man, getting down to our final question, I kind of saved this one because I do want a little surprise, but not too much of a surprise. Um, One of the things, man, just hanging out with you, especially when we was over at Dillard, um, and just kind of looking at some of the things that you've done, I think that you are very intentional. I think when I was taking down the banners and different things, when we was over there and we was working, he was like, oh man, you need any help? I'm like, nah, man, I got it. You know what I'm saying? Like typical dude stuff, right? No, I got it. I figured it out. I'm up here dropping one end, trying to hold the other end. But you know what I mean? But I remember watching, you come back again and say, hey man, look, I get it. Like I've been here, I've been in this space. And I think that you, I think it's the if point, walk with kings and keep the common touch. I think that you're very intentional in being able to talk to somebody about raising 100 million and then being able to be very practical and understanding that guy who's who's just doing the manual labor. And I kind of want to talk. I kind of want to have you kind of talk a little bit to that, like having that attitude of being able to be all things to all people in those
Mm.
moments. Like why is that important?
It's a great quote recently by the founder at NVIDIA. And one of his comments was, there's no job here that's beneath me. right? So, and he talked about clean urinals and clean toilets. And I'm sure he's cleaned more than I did, even though at the golf course I had my chance to clean as many as I probably wanted to do.
Mhm.
I just don't think any job is beneath you, right? I mean, here's the deal: when you're a founder, you get to do every job that you can't afford to hire someone to do. So, am I a good finance guy? I am now, but I had to learn it. Am I a good marketer? I think I'm a good marketer, but I'm not a great marketer. Am I a good product manager? I think I'm an okay product manager. So, as a generalist, I would tell you that I'm generally okay at a bunch of things. So I'm like, super wide and shallow.
Mhm.
I think as I look back at the founders I've invested in, almost 200 companies invested in total, I wish there was a test for self-awareness, because I think that test would predict founder success.
Mm.
Not the idea, not the company success. I think it would predict founder success,
Personal success.
personal success, right?
Gotcha.
Because so I separate out, like, sometimes we've brought into this cohort program founders that we like the founders, but we didn't like their idea very much, and we've been clear with them that we're like, we brought you in because we like you, and we think you're going to be a founder that impacts Seattle.
Mhm.
I don't know if this is the idea. Like, either I don't know enough about it, or I've seen this idea before. After seeing a few thousand ideas, maybe 3,000 or 4,000, like, there's not a lot of ideas. I'm like, oh, yeah, I've never seen that before. And when I see one that's totally new, I'm like, that's actually super interesting, right?
Mhm.
But the self-awareness is your ability as a founder is based on your ability to take in tons of input, right? We call it mentor whiplash on occasion. I'm getting a ton of feedback. Some of it completely disagrees with the others. Your ability to process that and decide how to go forward, not be galvanized by fear and not live in a fear world, but be galvanized by data. So I think it was data, actions, and outcomes, right? This data has led to, these are the actions we think we should take. Here's the outcomes we think. We have a thesis on what outcomes we should get. That's, I think that's the most important test, versus the person who drives headfirst into the wall, spends all of their money, and then says, oh, we're going to pivot. And I'm like, you don't have any money to pivot. You have to pivot before you run
Too
out of
late to
money,
quit.
right? Or your spouse has left you, or you lost your house, or you're like, failure is never fun. Never. There's not a badge of honor for it. And we don't talk about it enough in this startup community. And when we do, it's like you realize, holy shit, like, that was really bad, right? But watching somebody implode is never, so I think the self-awareness one is key. There's no job that's below me. The answer is, if it's my company, I got to do whatever I can to get the company up. And if you think something is beneath you, good luck. I just don't see that being a sign of personal success.
Dave, man, I want to thank you for taking the time. Man, we really do appreciate it. We really appreciate the time you spent down here, kind of just spending time in our community. That was a lot of fun. There's so much in this book, Trajectory Startup. I would encourage, each and every one of you, man, who have any dreams of being a founder, or just even if you're not in whatever phase you're in, I would encourage you definitely to take a look at the book, go out, get it. I even think that if you have a company that's up and going, that the process, that 6-month process, may be something that may rekindle or re-stimulate the way you think about your business, especially when you're having those marketing concepts and then going after those new customers as well. So once again, Dave, thank you so much, man. Spending time with our ecosystem. We
Always
appreciate
good to
you.
see you, buddy. Yeah.
Thank you always, man. Appreciate you. Take care, guys. We'll see you on
everybody.
the next show.